Among the 23 Canadian prime ministers so far, Louis Saint-Laurent probably still has one of the most, should I say, benign reputations, as that of a kind, grandfatherly prime minister who presided over various years, quite many years, of the post-World War II economic expansion of Canada, and also, of course, a new wave of immigration from the war-torn Europe, especially. Originally, he was called Louis Etienne Saint-Laurent. He then anglicized his, probably as an adult, his second name Etienne to Stephen. He was born in February 1882 in Compton, Quebec, and died in July 1973, aged 91, in Quebec City. He was the third Roman Catholic prime minister to serve as in Canada. He was a lawyer by the original training. He enthusiastically favored Canada's membership in the NATO to fight the spread of communism. Although in this decision he was opposed by some intellectuals, the communist-dominated Labour Progressive Party, and many fellow French Canadians. The contrast with Mackenzie King was not dramatic as far as the policy was concerned, but he was a much more organized and timely leader when it came to keeping his desk in order and his paperwork, and to coming to meetings on time. And his staff found that they were working with him rather than for him. These quotes are from Jim Lotzey's book on the Prime Ministers of Canada, from John A. Macdonald to Brian Mulrooney, published in 1987. And although he was already 66 years old when he took office as Prime Minister, he told the elevator's operator in the Parliament building to go home because he could walk downstairs as easily as anyone else in his cabinet. He also had this fond image of Uncle Louis or Oncle Louis, and kissed babies in election rallies and some other political events. He was neither an idealist nor a bookish intellectual, but an eminently moderate, cautious conservative man despite his party label, liberal, and a strong Canadian nationalist. He grew up fluently bilingual because his father, Jean-Baptiste Moïse Saint-Laurent, was a French Canadian, and his mother, Mary Ann Broderick, was an Irish Canadian. And his English had a noticeable Irish accent, while his gestures, such as a hunch of the shoulders, were French. He received degrees from Séminaire Saint-Charles-Borromée, Bachelor of Arts in 1902, and Université Laval, his law degree in 1905. In 1908, he married Jeanne Renaud, whom he survived in 1966. They had 2 sons and 3 daughters. He worked as a lawyer from 1905 to 1941, becoming even a professor of law at Université Laval in 1914. He became one of Quebec's leading lawyers and was so highly regarded that Arthur Meehan, in his brief cabinet in 1926, offered him a position. He also was offered a seat as a justice in the Supreme Court of Canada. He declined both offers. In late 1941, aged 59, he was called to federal politics when Liberal Prime Minister Mackenzie King appealed to his sense of duty. Prime Minister King's Quebec assistant or lieutenant Ernest Lapointe had died in November 1941, and King wanted to have a strong, well-respected member of cabinet to serve as a new deputy for Quebec to help deal with the volatile conscription issue. In February 1942, Louis Saint-Laurent, who had already entered the cabinet as Justice Minister in December 1941, won a by-election for Quebec East. Lapointe's a former riding. He had to deal with the defection of Soviet cipher clerk Igor Guzenko in Ottawa in September 1945. Guzenko himself and then subsequent investigations over the following few years showed that there were rather many Soviet spies in North America. King came to regard Saint Laurent as his most trusted minister and natural successor, and accordingly he was coronated at the Liberal Leadership Convention of August 1948 and then succeeded King in November of that year. He became Canada's second French-Canadian Prime Minister, although he was partly of Irish ancestry. He comfortably won the parliamentary elections of 1949 and 1953 with massive majorities. Saint Laurent and his cabinet oversaw Canada's expanding international role in the post-war world. His stated desire was that Canada would occupy a social, military and economic middle power role, not a superpower one, in the post-World War II world. In 1947, he identified 5 basic principles of Canadian foreign policy and 5 practical applications regarding Canada's international relations. Always highly sensitive to cleavages of language, religion, and region, he stressed national unity, insisting that our external policy shall not destroy our unity, for a disunited Canada will be a powerless one. He also stressed political liberty and rule of law in the sense of opposition to totalitarianism. He was an early supporter of British Prime Minister Clement Attlee's proposal to transform the British Commonwealth from a club of white dominions into a multiracial partnership. His government was modestly progressive, fiscally conservative, and run with business-like efficiency. The American-born C.D. Howe was nicknamed Minister of Everything, although already in the previous Mackenzie King government. The medical care was expanded, although it didn't become universal in Canada until after Louis Saint Laurent's retirement. He also modernized and established new social and industrial policies for Canada during his time in the Prime Minister's office. In 1949, he ended the practice of appealing Canadian legal cases to the British Privy Council's Judicial Committee, and therefore the Supreme Court of Canada became the highest avenue of legal appeal available to Canadians. In 1949, Newfoundland entered the Confederation as the last one of Canada's 10 provinces. In 1952, Vincent Massey, on his advice, was appointed as the first Canadian-born Governor-General of Canada. In 1956, Louis Saint Laurent's government introduced the policy of equalization payments, redistributing taxation revenues between provinces to assist the poorer provinces in delivering government programs and services. This move was considered by many, and has been considered by many, a strong one in solidifying the Canadian Federation, especially Quebec. By 1957, when he turned 75, he appeared tired, old, and out of touch. His government was also perceived to have grown too close to business interests. The 1956 pipeline debate in Canada led to the widespread impression that the Liberals had grown arrogant in power. And because they still had a comfortable majority in the House of Commons, they voted in closure to limit the hours of debate on that measure. Many people criticized Prime Minister Saint Laurent for having been too passive during the debate. On one occasion, he simply sat reading a book, like a fond father among his squabbling children, as a biographer of most Canadian Prime Ministers, Jim Lotz, put it. C.D. Howe was widely perceived as extremely arrogant, and Many people criticized Prime Minister Saint Laurent for not keeping this American-born so-called Minister of Everything in check. Western Canadians felt that the federal government had abandoned their interests and were rather favoring Ontario and Quebec and the United States. The pipeline was, despite the opposition's charges, completed early and under budget. So, as it turned out, in the June 1957 Canadian federal elections, while the Liberals were about 2% ahead of the Progressive Conservatives in the popular vote, the votes were unfavorably distributed for them, with many votes being in a sense wasted in Quebec, which remained a major Liberal stronghold, and therefore the Liberals ended up getting only 105 seats out of 265 compared to the Progressive Conservatives' 112. Having lost the seats, Saint Laurent decided to throw in the towel and resign as Prime Minister, making way for John Diefenbaker. He soon retired from Parliament as well. Taking up the practice of law. He then lived quietly and privately with his family. In 1967, he was made a Companion of the Order of Canada. That was one of his few public appearances during his retirement. He died of heart failure in July 1973. He was ranked number 4 on a survey of the 21st Prime Ministers through Jean Chrétien of Canada, done by Canadian historians and used by J.L. Granatstein and Norman Hilmer in their book Prime Ministers Ranking Canada's Leaders. The house and grounds in Compton, where Saint Laurent was born, were designated a National Historic Site of Canada in 1973. Saint Laurent's residence at 201 Grande Allée Est in Quebec City is protected as a recognized federal heritage building.